Hi, I'm Patrick, and welcome back to ISIB, also known as Live from Fife. So today we're going to look at the second one of our big theories, of our big stories about how the world works, and that is institutionalism, or liberal institutionalism, I should say. There's going to be a lot of mixing of terminology today because liberalism is a very big tent. So the idea today is that we will look at one of the theories that came out of a similar time as realism, is slightly younger than realism, but the interesting thing about it is that it takes a realist world and it derives different results from it, which I always think is a pretty smart thing of a smart way of arguing. So liberal institutionalism is our theory today. To better understand where liberal institutionalism comes in and what its arguments are, it is important that we first look at how realism worked again, just as a little refresher. So we heard that realism paints a pretty dark picture of the world. It is an anarchical world, so there's no overarching legitimate force that could help you if you're in trouble. That means if you want to ensure your survival, you have to achieve security, and you get that through getting the maximum amount of power. And in this world where everyone is vying for the most amount of power they can get, we heard that conflict is a very common thing, and it's very, very normal and very expected. Cooperation, on the other hand, is not very expected because it's difficult. There is a fundamental uncertainty in the world that makes it unlikely that actors can ever trust each other enough that they would cooperate in a sustainable way. So this world creates a lot of challenges, and the board game illustration of this world is a Risk game, or a used Game of Thrones. Obviously, that type of world is what we're looking at, with a constant competition for power and security, with security dilemmas, where states are interested in relative gains very much, so they are interested in them getting something out of it as long as the other one doesn't get more. So your loss is my gain, and the other way around. And where international organizations are marginal phenomena, so they're not really that important. All these organizations we will talk about, of course, aren't important in a realist world, really. But is this really an accurate way of thinking about the world? Robert Axelrod, one of the founders of liberal institutionalism, in the first chapter of his seminal book, The Evolution of Cooperation, gives a pretty simple example of a very specific situation. And it is the trench warfare in World War I. As we heard in the history lecture, the World War I was an extremely costly war, and at least at the Western Front, so the front between Germany and France, and further north than that, it was a trench warfare where armies were sometimes dug in for years at a time and barely ever moving. Now, that doesn't mean that the individual soldier had a very high life expectancy, but that's at least where the armies were. And Axelrod says this is a situation where you have two actors whose only goal is to kill each other. So a situation of maximum possible conflict. But, says Axelrod, even in that situation, we see repeated instances of cooperation between the two sides. And this could take the shape of, for example, the unofficial norm that you would not have your artillery hit the other side's supply train, because you knew if you hit their supply train, they would hit your supply train, and then you as a soldier would sit in the trench with no socks and no food and no munitions. No one wanted that. So they refrained from doing that. They exercised restraint, even though they were there to hurt and destroy and kill the other party. The most famous instance of this is, of course, the Christmas truce, where in 1914, so only a few months after the war had started, troops were fraternizing in the no man's land. You can see a photo on the top and illustration at the bottom. So troops from both sides were coming together. Germans and British soldiers were coming together to celebrate Christmas, which of course is bizarre because they had just spent 4 months trying to kill each other. There's a little video with a British soldier that was actually a part of this Christmas truce on the syllabus that you can watch. So it was only when the people in command stepped in and tried to suppress this type of behavior that it sort of stopped. But so what this really shows is that if actors cooperate even in an extreme situation that involves killing each other, if even that situation has some cooperation happen, does that then mean that realists maybe are just wrong about the world? Does that mean that it's not always the war of all against all, and that there's actually something in us that drives us to cooperation rather than to conflict? And in pointing this out, Robert Axelrod obviously built on a long line of thinkers, much like realism always likes to claim thinkers from 2,500 years back. Liberals can do the same thing. So this insight about maybe human nature and our drive to cooperation rather than conflict came, of course, out of the Enlightenment. So in the Enlightenment, of which Edinburgh, of course, was a major component, because Edinburgh, after all, was the Athens of the North in the Scottish Enlightenment. And so the Enlightenment had thinkers that now believed that the world was not like Thomas Hobbes had seen it, where it was constantly an all-out war and everyone was in conflict all the time. No, man was possessed of reason and of shared principles and values, and man could work out their differences without resorting to war. Hugo Grotius wrote an entire treatise that said that no, the world of states should actually have a code of conduct. It should be governed by law, and it shouldn't just be, winner takes all, loser dies kind of a world. It should be, even the world of warfare, it should be a war governed by rules and laws. And of course, this was picked up in the so-called Peace of Westphalia, this idea. Look it up, it's an interesting Wikipedia tangent. There was Swiss philosopher Emer de Vattel, who wrote a treatise on the international order, and who pointed out that even if we assume that states would be primarily self-interested, we could still imagine that they would have an interest in also serving the common interest. So just the fact that they're self-interested doesn't mean that they can't also cooperate. And then we had Kant as one of maybe the main figure of Enlightenment, really, who pointed out that there was a natural law deep within us, embedded in human nature, that told us that certain things were right and other things were wrong. And of course, he came up with the categorical imperative, the idea that you should do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So don't complain that others do to you what you previously did to them. So all these Enlightenment thinkers then thought about the idea that cooperation was actually just as much a part of human nature as maybe the realists had pointed out conflict was, in fact. And so the modern IR theorists that try to come up with an alternative to realism seized on these core liberal ideas and built their own theory. So liberal institutionalist theory was built on the idea that there's an international society of states, that it's not just all, billiard balls clashing into each other and in creating war, and apart from that, there's really nothing that connects us. It had the idea that progressive change was possible, so you could get better, states could be better people, and that there was something about interdependence that fundamentally changed how the world works. And we will look at what interdependence is in a second. Now, I have to mention here that I keep saying liberal institutionalism and liberal ideas and so on, and this terminology can sound a little confusing. Just remember this: liberalism is a very big tent. It's a lot of theory, a lot of ideas. All I can do in this lecture is take one slice out of it, and that is liberal institutionalism. And there's other liberal thinkers, of course, that have developed their own IR theories. Some of them are actually covered in the reading for this week, so have a look at that if you're interested in that. Some of the most seminal writings in this liberal institutionalism is John Eikenberry's After Victory, where he shows that the spread of democracy and the drive to international organizations was actually a common pattern after war and conflict. So yes, realists might be right in that there are recurring conflicts in world history, but, so Eikenberry points out, there are also recurring patterns of democratization and international organization, and an increasing constitutionalization of international order. So international order keeps getting more and more regulated and it gains more and more rules over time. And then we have Michael Doyle with his 1986 article about how liberal states do not go to war with each other. So we already talked about this in the concepts lecture, of course, and this is essentially the democratic peace. And he says that cooperation between states that are built on liberal ideas has created this own little bubble in the world where there's basically no war anymore. And that's weird. There might still be war between the bubble and outside the bubble, and of course war outside the bubble, but inside this world of liberal states, there is no more war. There's a separate peace there. And this has also been called one of the most important findings in IR ever. So I've given you a couple of people here that are some of the foundational thinkers of liberal institutionalism. And you see, again, all white people, obviously, they're also all Americans. There is, of course, people outside of the US that do this, but these guys and lady here wrote the foundational texts, really. And you will see them appear on your reading list, on which everyone else is kind of building. Now, I've already talked about the idea of interdependence, or at least I've mentioned it. Now, interdependence is really one of the core ideas that separates institutionalists from realists. So we have to take a closer look at it. Interdependence has kind of a very basic meaning, which is just interconnectivity, basically. It just says that the world is becoming more and more interconnected, and economies and societies are becoming more and more networked. You see on the right-hand side here a little graph that illustrates which world region trades with what other world region. And of course, this is all like a big, spider on meth type, spider web of connections. So that's really just a descriptive fact. We have increasing connectivity in the world, basically in the realm of globalized economies. And then we have maybe the more interesting way of thinking about interdependence, and that is the dependence part, in that there are more and more, so claim realists, more and more relationships between states that are actually mutually dependent on each other, and where just trying to sever those relations would incur costs. So think about it this way. Lots and lots of the things that you use every day here in the UK and that you eat and that you wear aren't produced in the UK. They come from elsewhere. And even if the UK wanted to make everything itself, wanted to make all its own clothes and produce all its own food and make all its own cars, in some areas it couldn't, because there's literally no producers of these goods left. This is produced in other countries, then traded, and that means that the UK is dependent on other countries to produce certain things that its citizens want. So interdependence really here as a situation of a mutual dependency, where what actor 1 does has an effect on what actor 2 does or can do. So the idea that what states do has consequences for each other. So this interdependence is one of the main points of departure on where liberal institutionalism diverges from neorealism. Actually, the two theories have a lot in common, and I've already said that they start from the same basic points. So they both say, yes, the world is anarchic. There is no institution on top of states, really, that has legitimate force. You can't call anyone if you're getting attacked as a state. The states are still the main actors, and yes, some non-state actors play a role in some liberal institutionalist theories, but it's mostly still states. The logic of action is the same. We still have goal-oriented, rational states, and they're still self-interested, but where we diverge now is in the bottom of this particular table. Liberal institutionalists think that it's all about absolute gains. So states, as long as they get something out of a deal, they don't really care about how much the other side is getting out of it, as long as they have more afterwards than they had before. I illustrated the relative gains idea in realism with a simple example of whether or not you would take the deal if your parents would give your sibling £100 if you would get £1. If you think that's not good and you'd rather have nothing for both of you than them getting so much more than you, then you are interested in relative gains. Liberal institutionalists say it's about absolute gains. You have £1 more afterwards, so of course you take that deal. Interdependence is the core characteristic of international relations, really. So it's not so much about the material structure of anarchy anymore. It's about how states are connected together and dependent on each other that determines much of what happens. And while in neorealism, the fundamental problem that we couldn't really ever get rid of was uncertainty, the problem that really drives states to do certain things here in liberal institutionalism is inefficiency. So how can we make this better, and how can we get the maximum out of it for us in any type of interaction? So if we know then that institutionalists see the world slightly differently, do they also have a different view of when we would expect cooperation? And it turns out that yes, they do, very much so. If you think about realists really say, you know what, we wouldn't really expect cooperation basically ever. Even if it happens, it would be very fleeting and not of great consequence. Institutionalists say, well, you know what, it depends. The institutionalists don't say cooperation always happens. They're not, some like hippie holding our hands, altruistic believers in the goodness of states. No, they say sometimes we wouldn't really expect cooperation, but other times we might. So then the question doesn't become, is there ever cooperation? Because institutionalists say that's a dumb question. Of course there is. The question becomes, cooperation, when is cooperation rational? So when does cooperation happen? Not if it happens. So in which circumstances do we expect cooperation, and when do we expect that cooperation to be institutionalized in the shape, for example, of something like the European Union? And how long will that cooperation last? So to think systematically about this, they first point out that, well, realists have a way for cooperation to happen, and institutionalists acknowledge this. It's a very simple way for cooperation to happen, and that's just if the biggest guy in the room makes everyone else cooperate. So a situation of hegemony. So you have one overwhelmingly powerful state, like we discussed in the last video, and that state makes others cooperate. And that could be for whatever reason. Maybe the hegemon just likes that, or the hegemon wants others to cooperate because that's easier for them to manage. Now, institutionalists say, though, that hegemony is one way of bringing cooperation about, but surely it's not the only way. So if it's not a necessary condition, if cooperation can happen other ways, there must be cooperation after hegemony. And that is, of course, why Robert Curhane calls his seminal book on liberal institutionalism After Hegemony, because he points out that there are ways in which states can cooperate that happen when you don't have hegemony, when you have a non-hegemonic world. So to think about those non-hegemonic situations when we could have cooperation, institutionalists use game theory. So game theory is really the attempt to systematically think about different situations and whether or not some situations might be more likely to entice states to cooperate than others. Game theory has two really basic rules. The one is that whenever we play a game, the outcome depends on both the involved actors' decisions. So no one can just say what's going to happen. And B, both of the players really know about this. They know that their decisions are mutually dependent, and they know that the other one knows. Now, as a little illustration of how this could work, I will give you what we call a two-player game with incomplete information. And through the magic of movie making, I will show you this. I will illustrate this in a little game played by two comedians on a game show. It's only going to take 3 minutes. Now, what you need to know about the situation is it's about two boxes that are on the table. Only one box contains a carrot, and everyone wants the carrot. So let's look in here and see how this game develops.
Okay, let's play. Carrot in a box. Okay, Sean, you can look inside your box. John, you cannot look inside your box. Okay, you want the carrot, Sean. No, don't put no hands in the box. You can look inside the box. Have you looked? Have you seen?
Yeah.
Okay, You now have to convince John to swap his box if you think he has the carrot, or keep your box. It's a game of bluff. The winner is the one with the carrot.
Oh, I'll keep this. It's got carrot there.
Okay.
It's a stupid game. What a carrot.
Okay. You have a choice. Do you want to swap or not? I mean, he seems confident there's a carrot in there. He's seen the floor in this game.
Jimmy's ploughing on.
What do you mean Jimmy's ploughing on? It's my job. Is Sean bluffing? Does he have a carrot in his box?
It's a real quandary for me, Jimmy, this.
Well, he can choose another box.
Yeah, he's allowed to swap if he wants
No,
to swap.
why can't I just keep my box?
No, he can swap if he wants
Well, I
to
can
swap.
refuse to swap it.
No.
You can't make somebody swap something. They don't want to swap it.
Have you never played carrot in a box before? Have you never seen the show?
I must
It's
have been on
prime
holiday.
time.
I must have been on holiday that week. It was allowed out.
Do you want to keep your box or swap your box?
I can keep this or I can have the box that's definitely got a carrot.
Yes.
I want Sean's box.
Okay, we'll grab Sean's box. Sean, let go of the box. It's the nature of the game. It's the nature of the game.
Can I just say at this point, if there's no carrot in that box, you are a genius.
Well, let's swap boxes. Swap boxes.
But am I allowed,
Swap the boxes. Swap.
am I allowed to have my box back? Is there another round where I get to have the box with the carrot in back?
I'm going to level with you, fellas. We've never played this game before. We do not know how it ends. Okay, so John, you're now allowed to look in your box.
Right.
And I believe you can reveal. Point it the other way. Does it contain a carrot or not?
No fucking
You are the winner. Congratulations.
So, a short little illustration of how a two-player game could be set up, and we see that many of the things we just said about game theory were definitely at play. Both players had mutually dependent decisions to make, and they both kind of knew about the rules of the game, but also you already saw that there was some interesting dynamics happening. If you want to have another little laugh, look up the rematch of this and see how the rematch of Carrot in a Box really works. You can also go on a little YouTube tangent and look up Golden Balls, which is very much in the same class of games being played, just a little bit meaner than this here. So that's a game then. In any game, because it's a formalized way of thinking about the world, in any game we have two players and they make two decisions each, which leads us to a specific way of writing this down, of notating this, and we'll come to this in just a second. So, different situations might have different outcomes in terms of how likely cooperation is. Let's start maybe with a very simple case where we would expect a lot of cooperation right away. Now, what is this an illustration here? This is Dagen H, and I can't speak Swedish, otherwise I would pronounce this properly. When in 1967, Sweden, the entire country of Sweden, decided to switch from driving on the left-hand side of the road, like in Britain, to driving on the right-hand side of the road, like all of its neighboring countries and the rest of Europe. Now, if you think this is like a madcap idea, it was, and this was created with a huge amount of resources. So everyone had to literally stop their car at a specific day on a specific time, wait, and then later, at a later point, turn the car on again, very slowly drive onto the other side of the road, and then keep driving on that side. And in the meantime, there was road crews running around, changing signs, changing the arrows on the road and all that. And so a huge effort here, really, to just choose a different side of the road to drive on. Now, why is this in a game being played here? Well, it's because choosing which side of the road to drive on is an example of a possible cooperation. The traffic really only runs smoothly if everyone chooses to cooperate and stick to one side of the road. Imagine how the roads would look like if 50% of the people would decide I drive on my left-hand side and 50% decided I drive on my right-hand side. It would look terrifying, obviously, and you would have accidents all the time. So you have a situation here where everyone has a good incentive to cooperate. How do we translate this into game theory? Imagine you have two players here, and each of the players can choose whether they drive on their left-hand side or their right-hand side. This little graph tells us what the possible outcomes are. Each of these cells gives you the value that each player attaches to the outcome of both decisions interacting. So the intersection here in the top left, where I have my cursor right now, means that player 1 chose to drive on the left and player 2 chose to drive on the left, and they have an outcome of 1, 1. In this type of notation, the first number always refers to the first player's valuing of that field, and the second number refers to the player 2's valuing of that field. And the higher the number, the more the players want to end up in that field. So you see there's two fields that are called 1, 1, and two fields that have two zeros in it. The players want the fields with the two ones more than they want the fields with the two zeros, because if you look at this field, for example, that has a 0, because the 0 means player 1 decides I drive on my right and player 2 decides I drive on my left, and that's not going to work because that means they end up at the same side of the road and they will crash into each other. So they don't want that. So in a coordination game like this, the overwhelming incentive for everyone is to end up in a coordinated outcome, so to choose the same thing. They don't really care all that much whether they both choose left or they both choose right, as long as they choose the same thing. So the 1 is higher than the 0, so they want to end up in those fields more than in the other ones. And they each can make a choice, and obviously the interaction of these choices determines the end result. So that's how things are written down. Two numbers in a field, and they give you the value that the players attach to this field. So let's make the situation a little bit more complex, because after all, this is fairly easy. Everyone has an incentive to cooperate. No one really wants to drive on the wrong side of the road because they feel like it. They would never get anything out of it and would be never the optimal outcome. They want to coordinate. What if we complicate the situation a little bit? And full disclaimer, I normally play this in the lecture hall with candy at stake. So let's see how well this goes without that. Imagine you have two players here. They can each again make two choices. They can either choose blue or they can choose red. And depending on the choices that they make, they can realize specific outcomes. Imagine this played with cookies. I am the game master of this, so I'm Jimmy Carr in this particular instance. And I have two cookies to give out. Now, if both players choose blue, they both get one cookie each, so they split the pot, and that's nice of them. If one of them chooses blue and the other one chooses red, the blue player is the sucker because the red player gets the whole pot, gets two cookies from me, and the blue player gets nothing. Obviously, this goes the other way around. So if player 2 chooses blue and player 1 chooses red, player 1 gets all the cookies. If they both, however, choose the red strategy, if they both choose red, then nobody gets a cookie, and I, as the game master, keep all the sweets. Why is this such an interesting game here? It's an interesting game if you think about the strategies that each player now has to run through. So they can either choose to cooperate, that's blue, or they can choose to what we call defect, and they can choose red. Why would they ever choose red? Well, look at the outcomes here really quickly. If you look at the cooperative outcome, where both get one cookie, that's a pretty good outcome, and that's why this gets a 3. They could, however, be better off if only the other party cooperated and they defected. So the best outcome for you as a player isn't for both players to cooperate, It's for the other player to cooperate and for you to defect, for the other player to show blue and for you to show red. Because if you look at this field, that is valued as 3 by both players, but player 2 might be thinking, twirling my mustache here. I have a 3 here, but actually a better outcome, of course, than 1 cookie would be 2 cookies. So if that person cooperates and I defect, I actually get 2 cookies, and 4 is more valuable than 3 because that is the outcome I like even more. The problem in this situation is that it's not just one player thinking that. The other player is doing exactly the same thing from the other side. They are also thinking, well, cooperation is nice. 1 cookie is good, but 2 cookies are better. So if I defect while the other one cooperates, I will get the whole payoff and the other one is the sucker. So what they decide each on their own is, well, the optimal strategy clearly is for me to defect. Because that way I can maximize my potential gains. If both of them defect, though, if both choose the red option, they actually end up in a situation of no cookies. And that is super confusing because, of course, to them, they thought they would choose the optimal strategy and get 2 cookies out of it. But because they both chose that, they actually get 0 cookies out of that. So it turns out that once they end up down here in the 0 cookie situation, they actually paradoxically would have been better off if they had cooperated, because then at least they'd gotten 1 cookie. So why could they not do that? Well, it was because they didn't want to be the sucker. So let's talk about this a little more systematically. So the prisoner's dilemma is, of course, what this game is called, is a situation in which both players want to cooperate with the other one, and there would be something in it for them, but they are tempted because the unilateral defection has a higher payoff attached. 2 cookies is better than 1 cookie. And the dilemma situation happens because that strategy is individually optimal. It's individually optimal because you can get 2 cookies out of it. But because both players are choosing this at the same time, they end up in a collectively suboptimal position where they both actually have no cookies instead of 2 cookies. Now you could have been asking yourself, why, by the way, is the both get no cookie situation better than a situation where only one of them gets no cookie? Or think about it from the situation of player 1. Why, in my case here, why is this field for me less good than this field? This field has a 1, so when I cooperate and the other one defects, I get no cookies. But this field has a 2, even though in this situation we both get no cookies. Why is that the case? Well, it is because I don't want to be the sucker. I don't want to be the one that sits there with no cookies while someone else walks away from the deal with 2 cookies. That is the outcome I want to prevent. And because I want to prevent that outcome, I choose defect. The other one chooses defect too, and we both end up with no cookies. But that's still a little bit better than the other one walking away with 2 cookies, right? So it's kind of the sibling situation again. So prisoner's dilemma is a dilemma because individually optimal strategies lead to collectively suboptimal outcomes. And game theorists say that this is an inevitable outcome if this particular game, this prisoner's dilemma, is played only once. Even if the players can communicate with each other, I can tell you all kinds of things about how I'm definitely going to choose blue, and then I choose red after all, once I've lured you into a false sense of security. I've played this many times in the lecture hall, and you wouldn't believe the type of pretty hilarious situations that emerge from this, where colleagues that have been sitting together for an entire term suddenly backstab each other over a couple of ginger snaps, like it's something to behold. So communication doesn't really change things, and repeating the game can change things a little, because once you repeat the game, you have to deal with the same person again. So if you were nice and cooperated and the other one betrayed you, you can retaliate at them and you can betray them in the next move. But again, that is not really that stable a situation. So repeating the game doesn't fundamentally change your idea that unilateral defection is always the best possible option. And why are we talking about this at such length? It is because liberal institutionalists say that this type of situation, a prisoner's dilemma type situation, is actually very common in the interactions between states. So a lot of situations of IR are actually prisoner's dilemmas. Think about an arms race for a second. In an arms race, the best possible outcome, and let's go back to this graph for a second. In an arms race, you could have several possible outcomes. Both of the states could cooperate with each other and not really arm themselves all that much. Means they can save money for more important things. But the worst possible outcome would be if you stick to the agreement, if you don't arm yourself, you cooperate, and the other one defects and they arm themselves massively because then they can roll in and just conquer you. You want to prevent that sucker's outcome to happen. So therefore, even if they verbally agree to not arm themselves, not to enter into an arms race, they end up being scared of being the sucker and ending up both defecting, which means they both build up their armaments and enter into an arms race, and they end up in this situation down here, where they actually have to spend huge amount of resources to only be balanced again, and therefore be really only in the situation that they started with. So if only they could have trusted each other and cooperated and not armed themselves, they would be better off, of course, than if they entered into an arms race. But because they're both worried about being the sucker, they cannot escape the logic of the game, say institutionalists. A common example of this is overfishing, which is a situation in international relations where, let's say you have an ocean, the ocean has a limited amount of fish in it. If you want to prevent no one being able to fish anymore, what you really have to do is manage fisheries. So everyone has to exercise restraint. Don't send all your ships in there and pull all the fish out. Pull a limited amount of fish out. But in that situation, you have to hope that everyone sticks to that agreement. Because of course, you as a devious nation, your best possible outcome is if everyone is nice and restrained and they only pull a few fish out to prevent overfishing, but you go in and you pull all the ones out that you can. But then because everyone thinks that way, everyone hopes for everyone else to be the sucker while they can get the most out of it, that then leads to everyone just pulling all the fish out that they can. And of course, overfishing is a less good outcome than if everyone had cooperated and just pulled a limited amount of fish out and therefore managed the amount of fish that was in the sea. So institutionalists see these types of dynamics, these prisoner's dilemmas everywhere. And this even applies to daily life. Once you start looking for prisoner's dilemmas, you will see them everywhere. Just one quick example, and you can run through the others by yourself. Product pricing. Think for a second why the pricing of petrol is a prisoner's dilemma between everyone running petrol stations everywhere. So prisoner's dilemma type situations are difficult because while actors want to cooperate, they also really can't because they're too worried about the effects, about the results if the other one doesn't cooperate. So how do we then get from a situation of interdependence and these types of prisoner's dilemma type situations to the possibility of stable cooperation between the actors that are involved? I've already hinted at one possible way out of this, and that is to repeat the game, because repeating the game allows you to adopt what's called a tit-for-tat strategy. So imagine you start the game by cooperating because you're a nice person, but then in the very first round, your opponent betrays you immediately. If you only play this once, the only thing you can go is, kind of put your hands in your pockets and go home, and the other guy gets all the cookies. But if this game is played multiple times, you can actually say, hold on, you have betrayed me in the previous move, so I will now betray you in the next move. And if you keep betraying me, I will keep betraying you. I will do unto you as you have done unto me, which is, of course, a tit-for-tat strategy. Maybe then the other actor is scared into rather cooperating because they are worried about you retaliating against them with also defecting. And of course, we know that if you play the game 10 times and you cooperate 10 times, you have 10 cookies. But if you both defect 10 times, you both have no cookies at all. So maybe reciprocity is the way to stable cooperation. It's good because it's, very cheap. there's really not much you have to do besides credibly threaten to retaliate. And this is essentially a game that is built on promise. Another way of getting out of this situation of a prisoner's dilemma could be institutionalizing the interaction. And this is, of course, a key element in, who would have thought, institutionalism as a theory. So the idea that you can change this prisoner's dilemma situation by creating regimes and institutions, creating rules, is something that's key to institutionalism. So this is a permanent way to change the game that has very high costs, because you have to set up organizations, you have to set up rules, you have to sign treaties, you have to do all kinds of things to stabilize this cooperation. Much like you would follow the rules of Monopoly. You're not just going to change the rules of Monopoly halfway through. Everyone sticks to them and everyone respects the outcomes that the game then generates. So these are both viable ways to get from interdependence to stable cooperation, but, say institutionalists, the one is the much more permanent, the much more enduring, and the much more stable one, and that is institutionalization. So these institutions then are, as defined by Krasner, explicit principles, norms, rules, and decision-making procedures. Notice, though, that that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be an organization. Institutions are more than that. Institutions is every form of formalized cooperation, really. So they could be the organizations like the UN, as you see in the bottom left there, or they could be just some, for example, treaties that you sign, as you see there on the bottom right, that regulate the interactions between the players. So you could then ask when these institutions are created, because clearly not every situation is equally prone to cooperation. So maybe there's also differences in the situations in terms of how likely it is that institutions are created. If you have conflicts without common interests, and of course you need conflicts in the first place, because if you don't have a conflict, what are you trying to regulate here? If you have a conflict and you have no common interests, then we also wouldn't think that there is no real likelihood of institutions emerging. A common way of illustrating this is territory. If two states are in conflict about territory, everyone can really only own a piece of land at one time. So a piece of land can really only be owned by one state at a time. You can't timeshare a slice of your country. So there you have no common interests, and we wouldn't really think that you come to an institutionalized form of cooperation. I've also already said that if there is no real conflict, why do you even need institutions? If there's nothing to regulate, then why are you creating organizations, for example? So if everyone is already of the same opinion, then you can just forego the creation of institutions. It is only in situations where you have some conflict, so there is some things that you want to regulate, but you also have some overlapping interests, that we think that institutions are likely. So one example is that, yes, climate change is real, and yes, states are trying to tackle it. They might have a conflict over how best to tackle it and who has to do how much, but exactly those questions are then the ones that can be settled inside of institutions, through treaties like the Kyoto Protocol, for example, or through organizations like the United Nations, maybe. Whether or not institutions are really set up and what shape these institutions then take depends not only, though, on the type of conflict and the level of compatibility of interests, but also on other factors such as the nature of the problem. And I like always illustrating this with the example of, what do we eat for dinner? So if you think you and your partner are sitting at home and you are deciding on what to get for dinner, we would expect different conflicts to result in different levels of cooperation, different probabilities of compromise. If you have conflicting values about goals, what that means is that you already have a conflict when it comes to, what are we eating for dinner? Are we ordering something, or are we cooking ourselves? That is not really something you can come to a compromise. You can't cook a little bit and also order stuff a little bit. So you have to solve that first. And in that situation, compromise seems unlikely if you really both want to stick to your goals. If you step a little down from that, though, if you've already decided, okay, you know what, I don't want to cook tonight, we are going to order something, you could then have conflicts about relative goods characteristics. So you could have a conflict, for example, about whether to order Indian or Chinese. That's a little bit less of a fundamental conflict than the one over cooking versus ordering, but it's still a conflict. And we would still think that probably the probability of compromise is not that high. If you really, really love Indian and the other person really, really loves Chinese, it's going to be difficult to order something there. If you step down from that, though, if you've solved that problem and you've both agreed to get Indian, you could then have conflicting interests about absolute goods characteristics. What's the Indian place we're ordering from? The one likes the one Indian place, the other person likes the other Indian place. This is already a situation, though, where you've solved a lot of the previous problems. You already decided that you're going to order. You've already decided on Indian. So now you're really only, what's left to decide is who you're ordering it from. And then if you've settled that, you know you're going to order from the Taj Mahal. The conflicting means for reaching these goals can come into play. So you've already decided that you're going to order. You already decided you're going to order Indian. You've already decided to order it from a specific place. And now the question becomes, well, do we order online or call on the phone? And in that situation, that really seems that there's a very high likelihood then that you would find a compromise, because the thing you have a conflict about is really not that important in the greater scope of things. So you see, like, the nature of the problem here determines how likely cooperation is and how much we would expect institutions to emerge. So we've heard then that institutionalism is a theory that sees the world a little differently from realism and that arrives at different conclusions, even though it has similar points of departure. So we could be asking, is it a good theory then? What's good about it is that it takes realist assumptions but shows that different things can come out of this. There can be an anarchical world with lots of cooperation happening. It could also explain why there's just empirically, if we look outside our window, why empirically there is more cooperation than conflict. There is, after all, not a war every weekday between all the states in Europe. There's far less and far more cooperation, which realists can't properly explain. And it also doesn't just concentrate on power politics. The economy also matters, for example. And it ascribes a role to international institutions. They have an important role to play in how states interact. It's still, of course, largely focused on states. So if you are super interested in non-state actors, for example, maybe not the theory for you. Maybe if you don't just want to emphasize material gains, but you want to look at other things you can gain, prestige maybe this is not the theory for you then. It also still relies very much on rational choice actors. So you have a lot of this, hi, I am a robot, need to maximize economic gains kind of thing going on, which might be a little bit too simplified a way to think about the world. And that means that the world that institutionalism describes, just like the one realism describes, just isn't super human, really. It's not very social in a sense. So, summing up, we have a world in institutionalism that is anarchic, but it's still rational to cooperate because states are interdependent and they care about their absolute gains. They will not always cooperate, but they will often cooperate if there's something in it for them and they can come to an actual agreement over how that cooperation could look. It is the fact, though, that the world contains a lot of prisoners' dilemmas. So if you have those situations, cooperation will be difficult. But you can still overcome those situations if you create institutions, for example, that can stabilize cooperation, observe the way that people are adhering to the rules, and therefore regulate anarchy. So that was it for today for institutionalism. Next time we will look at the first theory that actually properly takes into account that the world is a social space, and that is constructivism. So let's see what that theory tells us about the world in the next video. I'll see you then.